Right, so this is the JS everywhere thing. I think we're all JavaScripty people, so we're pretty happy to see JavaScript popping up in all these new and interesting places. I'll start off with a little bit of self-introduction. I work at Yammer. I'm a web dev. I've been doing building stuff for the web for, I guess, kind of a long time at lots of different places in the web stack. But my home has pretty much always been JavaScript, so I'm really excited to see what's happening in technology now with JavaScript taking over in all these different places. Right, so talking about JavaScript everywhere, the good news and the bad news, the agony and the ecstasy, I guess. The good news is, if you're a JavaScript guy, you get to use JavaScript now in all these new and interesting places, right? Bad news is that you have to make your code run in all of these different places, right? So kind of like people who are using Linux as a desktop operating system before the Ubuntu guys came along. The good news was that you could configure your OS to your heart's content, but the bad news was you had to configure your OS, right? So it's a very similar story, and I guess probably the Linux guys would point out that the opposite and equal corollary applies on the Mac side, right? You kind of can't configure anything. Right, so everywhere. I'm going to be talking a little bit about desktop and mobile, a tiny bit about system tools, JS on the server, and then browser just for completeness. We don't really need to talk about that because we've been doing it for such a long time. Right, so what to expect from this talk? First of all, you're not going to see a bunch of JavaScript-y triumphalism. I don't think that's probably very necessary anymore. This trend of JavaScript encroachment has been going on for a really long time. I can remember early in 2007, a guy named Steve Yagi wrote a post he entitled NBL, which was talking about JavaScript as the new big language. And I remember at the time, myself, being fortunate enough to already be doing lots and lots of JavaScript. It was really exciting for me, because I kind of idolized Steve, to see that he was seeing it too. JS is the language of the browser is your viewport into this interconnectedness of the web, and so pretty simple equation, and it's just a matter of sort of marching forward inevitability, right? Another thing not to expect is a lot of pat answers, because this is all very new. It's been going on for a long time, but the mainstreaming of this is still relatively new. We're kind of still sort of making this stuff up as we go along. Kind of like some parts of this talk. Right, so the obvious benefits of using JavaScript in all these different places, probably don't have to sell you guys on some of this, although I see that there are lots of guys coming into JS from other places, and they're finding out, whether they were Python people or Java people or Ruby or what, that JavaScript is a pretty good language to use, right? We like it, it's fun. And surprisingly for me, more important than the code reuse, which is nice, is not having to switch back and forth. Having finished my first sort of large full-stack JavaScript feature at Yammer in the past couple of months, it was really, really amazing how much more productive you become when you're not suddenly needlessly paranoid about white space in your front-end code or needlessly inserting semicolons on your server-side code. It's a good feeling, and it's a lot easier to achieve a sort of flow state where you're just building the thing. It's a really great feeling. So we'll be talking about desktop JS and mobile JS. I'm going to kind of lump those together. Reason being that despite the fact that your UI constraints are a little different and the screen size is a little bit different, the method of developing these apps is still pretty much the same, whether you're working on the desktop or mobile. There's 4 sort of categories of apps. And because of what we've done at Yammer, specifically with our desktop client, I'm going to be focused very specifically on writing in JS, this thing of sort of launching a minimal browser. It's an installed app, but it still sort of runs like a browser. It's a bunch of ways to build apps, but they're the same whether it's desktop or web. So focusing on an installed app, I think it's probably at least worth touching on. I don't want to derail the JavaScript everything thing too much, but it's worth at least talking about this discussion of whether you should be building a native client or not, because it's something a lot of people are talking about. Had a very long and involved discussion with one of our engineers, Coda Hale, on Saturday during our data center move about the problem with native apps versus non-native apps. So it's at least worth mentioning. This whole discussion was kind of crystallized in a blog post by Alex Payne, formerly of Twitter, basically decrying Air as a development environment. And the TLDR of his blog post was essentially that if you're deploying an Air app, you don't care about your customers. That was sort of the takeaway from his blog post. And I think he backpedaled a little bit when there were some responses to his blog post. He backed off on some of the more incendiary pieces of it. The point is valid, but I think the question of whether or not to develop this kind of an app is affected by two very, very important and practical things. The first one being the simple practicality of what do you do if you need to ship an app, right? You can't necessarily hire someone for every environment that you want to ship for. Maybe you can't contract out. Maybe it's too hard to manage the relationship with your contractors or ensure you're actually not getting crap, right? Or just don't ship an app. One of the responses from the guy who does the Spazz Twitter client, which is a JS app, I think he has a very good point. It may be easier to develop a bad app using one of these frameworks, but being native, there's plenty of crappy native apps. If you've ever used Windows shareware, it's very, very easy to build a crappy app, whichever thing you're using. It may be a little bit harder to do a nice app with something like Air, but it's not like it's impossible. So the second point, and this is maybe the more salient, what does native even mean when the app that you're talking about is first and foremost or is originating as a web app, right? So here's a very good example. Facebook has released an update to their iOS client that renders the feed with the same markup and JavaScript as their generic mobile site, right? Facebook is a web app. So what do you do when your app is sort of inextricably linked with the web, and anything you do interacting with the app, or lots of things, take you to other parts of the web, right? So it's not entirely clear that native is better. I don't think. It's maybe up for debate, and this was sort of my discussion with Coda. The crappiness of this environment, how much of it is because it's kind of webbish, it's this neither fish nor fowl problem, or how much of it is just that the implementation isn't very good? And I don't think there's a clear answer for that. In any case, we have now a new desktop web app. It's an Air app using all of the same JS that powers our website. So there are some sort of environmental constraints building an app like this, and then there are also some sort of macro level impacts on your development process that come from having this kind of an app. Specific to the environment, obviously you're dealing with an older version of the browser. You end up with some either crippled or sort of non-standard implementations of things that you come to expect in a modern browser, like no eval after document onload means, say, for example, you can't use EJS, right? If you're wanting to use EJS, you're SOL. You have a relatively nice mechanism of communicating between windows, but it's not post-message. It's this other sort of weird thing, the sandbox bridge thing that's separate. So you end up in your JS code with the crappy browser block, the good browser block, and then the other Air block. Now you have yet this other not either one environment that you have to support. And of course, the biggie is that the tools are still not there. And this is kind of a continuing refrain that we'll see over and over. Debugging is terrible. We're kind of spoiled with the tools that we have in the browser. So at the macro level, the impact that it has on your development process, because of course now this code is all distributed out in people's desktops and they may or may not have the wherewithal to upgrade their app. You have to be a lot more careful. The people developing the WebJS have to be a lot more careful with their development process because you're syncing up at points in time with the desktop code base. The corollary to that, of course, is that you can't simply push a bug fix on the front end and on the back end. You can make changes to your back end code, you can make changes to your web code, but it has to be backward compatible, which ends up being kind of a pain in the ass in some cases. So I guess this is probably, yeah, you can sort of shine a spotlight on this. This is the takeaway. Versioning is really, really important if you're going to be doing this sort of cross-environment development. And not necessarily simply adding a tag. It's very important to make sure that everyone understands what the ramifications of the various tagging scheme might be. So are we going to do the odd and even thing? Are we going to, how do you know when the API breaks, essentially, right? So is it 1, 2, 3 and then go, or is it 1, 2 and then go on 3? So the next one is also important, or is bigger than just the desktop JS thing, but it is very important in that environment, which is wrapping things that are utilities that you expect to use in these various environments. So a good example is, for us, we have a thing called yam.global that points to the global object. So whatever environment we happen to be in, we know that that's what that is. Weaning your developers off of these magical things that are just existing in the global space. Having a single entry point where you can, in your code, where you can push in the dependencies rather than expecting them just to be out there in the air. Privates are nice, but sometimes you need a monkey patch so that you can just ship. It's not necessarily pleasant, but it's reality, and it's nice to have that tool at your disposal. So I like private methods, but sometimes they can be problematic. The last one is probably the most problematic we found, simply because it's really, really onerous if you're a WebJS guy to set up one of these other environments to test in, right? But and this is still not a solved problem for us. It's really, really important. I myself have been guilty, you guys know, of making some change, happily making some change in the code base, knowing that there's absolutely no possible way it could affect the desktop. But sure enough, because I'm not firing up the desktop, and because we have no automated tests on that yet, right? So this is the other refrain in this, besides tools, is testing. I ended up breaking stuff. So for system tools, the system tools bit, I'm only going to talk about one thing, and that's simply because I have a lot of personal experience with it. This is the Jake build tool. So if you're used to a tool like Rake, it will feel very, very familiar. Does all the stuff that you would expect a build tool to do, or most of the things. There's one interesting addition because it's built for Node. It supports asynchronous tasks. Of course, it's asynchronous. It's built for Node. And unlike other projects that I may or may not have worked on, this is actually maintained and bug fixed. Yeah. Okay, so this is what a task would look like, or the description of, this is what you would find in a Jake file. These are some examples. It's pretty straightforward. You can see in the Spazz task, it's passing dependencies as an array. It's all pretty straightforward. You notice that it's console.during the arguments, so you can actually pass arguments, and if you go look at the README in the GitHub project, you'll see how to do that. There's a nice way to pass stuff in. This is what an asynchronous task would look like. You just pass a flag to the task setup. It's an optional flag that says it's asynchronous, and you call the complete manually when you're done. It also has a bunch of the stuff that that Rake users would expect, like task.execute, invoke, re-enable, a global fail, etc. Right. So the thing that we're all kind of here for, and we're all so super excited about, is finally having like real, decent, usable JavaScript on the server. The interesting thing is, if you notice the picture, and I love the fact that this book is still available on Amazon, right? So I don't know what year this thing came out. It would be late 90s. But JS on the server has been around for actually a really long time. Here's a nice long list, starting with the original gangster SSJS, with Netscape, Microsoft IIS. So I wrote my first server-side JavaScript probably in the early 2000s in a classic ASP app, right? Helma, which is still around, is a Rhino-based solution. They did some interesting stuff with prototypal inheritance in the ORM. Whitebeam was SpiderMonkey and XML. Then there was this thing called Zimkey. Does anybody remember Zimkey at all? Yeah? If I remember correctly, it was SpiderMonkey, and the I/O was all mod Perl, something like that. They were also very interesting in that they were the first group of people I ever saw trying to do something like a development platform as a cloud service. This was before the word cloud was being batted around like it is now. Jaxer, I want to make some kind of a joke like, yo dog, I see you like Mozilla and you like servers, so I put Mozilla in your server, but couldn't think of a good way to do that. The last ones are all projects that seem to be ongoing now. A bunch of JVM-based solutions, and then of course Node.js, which makes us all very happy as JavaScript developers. And then the very last item here at the bottom, just because it's very relevant to what we're doing at Yammer, is these embedded solutions where you can stick V8 in something else, right? So it's so exciting now to have feature parity. Get it? No? No? Okay. That's terrible. I'm deeply sorry. But it is very exciting to have feature parity now with the server. You don't have to switch to something else. You don't have to keep these different semantics in your mind, switching back and forth between the two things. It's really exciting to be able to console.log in the middle of your work, and you don't know, you can't remember which environment it's going to be, the output is going to be, you're going to be seeing the output in, or forgetting whether you should be refreshing the browser or restarting the server. It's a good problem to have, and it's very exciting to be a JavaScript developer now. So some of the very obvious benefits of our code sharing, we mentioned that a minute ago. These are the sort of obvious places you would want to share code. And for me, the big win here is validation, just because it's the fiddliest probably bit of your code, and it's really irritating trying to remember to keep them both in sync. You make a change to the client-side validation and forget to go do it in Ruby land or Python land or wherever it is you have to go. So to bring forward an example of that, right? The Getty Web Framework. It's not dead. It's just resting. We are using some pieces of this in production at Yammer, and the pieces that we're actually using are well maintained. The rest of it, apologies, not so much. I'm hoping to have a chance to work on that. So here's a good example. This is a model from the server, and if you've ever used Active Record or Data Mapper or any ORM like that, this should look very familiar to you, right? This is just a model with a validation added. And this is the same model, this is the same model on the browser, right? So let's do that again. Server, browser, right? It's really nice because it's exactly the same. And when you create a Getty app and you create a resource, then you run the script that creates one of these scaffolds that has all the UI code. It literally takes the server-side model, changes a line, and copies it from app models into public JS models. It's that simple. It's really beautiful. If you're a JavaScript guy, it's really nice. So of course it's not all sunshine and unicorn poop. We have the problem, we've been talking, there have been a bunch of talks about this through the last couple of days, modules talking about the problem of how to get the code into the runtime. And of course, the JavaScript's historic ties to the browser means that sometimes it's kind of hard to get away from the DOM, right? So much code assumes the DOM. So if you were to ask a workaday like anything, generic language programmer, what's the JavaScript library? Obviously, the answer would be jQuery, which is intimately tied to the DOM. So a nice way to share code, if you have very little code to share between the two environments, you might actually be able to get away with the stupidest possible solution, which is this, right? Some commonsensical naming convention in both server and browser, and checking to see if there's a module that needs to, where you can export your foo namespace that you've created, right? The problem with that, of course, is this. Ad hocing your code oftentimes turns into sort of a big mess of crap. And sadly, this is code that is still in use in the Getty model stuff. You can see with the require sys that it's pretty old, and it could probably be done a lot nicer. But this is what happens if you try to start minimal and you don't actually plan. So thankfully, there's a bunch of work being done on modules to improve that. There were numerous talks about that in the past couple of days, so there's no real need to go over it, with the sole exception of saying, this is nice, it's good to see all this work going on, but when you have a large and very, very complicated front-end code base like we have at Yammer, taking something that's written like this, a very familiar pattern, for creating some module of code and then getting it into the browser runtime, when you have a lot of this, it's really hard to turn it all into this, right? It's a pretty big change, and it's a really ugly API too. No disrespect intended. I've looked at this a lot and thought about it a lot, and it's hard to imagine how you could do this any differently, but it is kind of awkward. It's an awkward API. Maybe server-side preprocessing, I don't know. It's worth considering. So this is just here for completeness. It's not something that we're really using at Yammer. We're still dealing with just rendering templates, but it's worth mentioning that there's a lot of interesting and solid work going on in this area. So what we are using is this thing called the Ruby Racer, which embeds a V8 process in Ruby. It's a very, very simple interpreter. There's no I/O affordances. There's no window. All you get is a simple interpreter, and there's some niceties for getting variables from Ruby land into your JavaScript. So would JavaScript be the peanut butter or the chocolate? I've been kind of thinking about this. What do y'all think? Is JavaScript more like the peanut butter or the chocolate? No votes? Nobody cares? What? What's that? It's probably the peanut butter? Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, Ruby's more like chocolate, maybe. Okay, so anyway, you run your code and you get back some value in Ruby. Here's an example of what some of the code might look like. You can see we're shimming out the window object because you look at how the code is loaded and runs. You basically have global loading and global execution, and that's it. So it's a lot more similar to the browser model than it is to the stuff we have on the server. So shimming out the window, creating this goofy logging string thing because there's no real way to log except outputting that log string at the end. It's really sort of back to the late 90s where you're like sticking a div on the page and like outputting stuff to this hidden div. It's very, very similar to that. Right, which brings us to the last big piece. And I have to confess I had to make some serious changes to this at the end in the last couple of days because I was anticipating just sort of throwing this grenade out into the room and hoping that I could escape in the confusion because it's a really ugly question still. So initially, this was going to be my slide, my one slide. Anybody? No? Kind of? Yeah? All right. So this guy he's obviously a Klingon. You're geeks, right? You should recognize at least a Klingon, right? He's really, really good at meting out punishment to the appropriate parties, right? So this is sort of my go-to internet meme for anything punishing that you're having to engage in. And comprehensive multi-environment JavaScript testing is really, really punishing. It's really awful. It's getting better, but it's terrible. So the question is why? What's wrong? First of all, obviously JS is historically the thing that's given it so much strength is that it's closely connected to the browser. But everyone thinks of JavaScript testing as, or maybe less so now, but traditionally it was very, very tied to the UI, and testing the UI is really brittle and really, really hard to do. You have tools like Selenium or Windmill that make it a little less horrible, but it's still brittle, and it's always integration testing, and there's always a bunch of environmental stuff you have to set up to get it to work. Now, of course, we have lots of business logic, API logic, stuff living both in the browser, potentially then in the server too. And then you have all of this code that's sort of in the spectrum in between. So sometimes it's a little difficult to tell what method of testing you should be applying to which pieces of your code. So is this unit testable code? Is this something that I have to actually mock a bunch of stuff out to test? If I mock all this stuff out, how can I be sure that I'm not actually just testing my mocks, right? And then, on top of all of that, now getting the code into the runtime is really irritating in all these different environments because it's different. So when I first started working at Yammer, one of the first things I did, because I wanted to test code in all these environments, was I wrote this thing called Logan that was a test runner. And the code to actually load, I think this was the browser adapter. I tried to make require work, essentially, as a global synchronous include of the code. And it works. I mean, this works, but it's terrible. You just look at that. It's awful. And you look at that, and you can't help but think that there's got to be a better way to do this. And fortunately, there are a bunch of smart people working on this. So the other problem is getting people to agree on what the requirements are for testing, because everybody has a different idea about testing, which probably explains why there's so many testing frameworks. So for us, at least, the main consideration was that it had to be easy to run without a bunch of extra setup, without a bunch of onerous like setup and installation of stuff, simply because the more impetus there is, the harder it is to convince people to actually run the tests regularly, right? We also, of course, because of that, wanted it to be automatable, and ideally you'd like it to be automatable in the browser if you can. That's a nice to have. It's nice at least to get it running under something like Rhino or Node, but it's even better if you can actually be automating it in the browsers, because if you're not testing in the actual environments, you're not really testing. Tests that say only run under Node with continuous integration it's good, it's better than nothing, but you're still not really testing your code, right? So, over the last couple of days, there have been a couple of projects that are finished enough for me to start looking at and start wanting to do something with. Bob Ramika, sitting over there, has mostly finished up FooUnit. It's looking really promising. I've rewritten all the Getty model tests for the code that we use at Yammer with FooUnit. Adam Christian had a great presentation yesterday with Jellyfish, which is browser launching and code injection, which is sort of the other half of the puzzle, or other piece of the puzzle. So hopefully with the two of those, it looks like it's going to be pretty easy to plug in the FooUnit tests to Jellyfish, and we'll actually be able to move forward. So this is an example of what a unit test would look like with FooUnit. And I can already run it in Node and run it in the browser. The only thing now is actually plugging it into a continuous integration with Jellyfish. So I'm really, really excited about this because it's so much better than what we've been trying to work with. So sort of to wrap up, I guess, yeah. So if you've been watching what's been going on since the early 2000s, it's pretty obvious that the JS Genie is out of the bottle, right? There's no putting the toothpaste back in the tube, no matter how much other server-side language people might prefer. It's pretty much done. JS is everywhere, and it's going to be, you're going to be seeing it in even more places and in even more environments. It's awesome to have this real, easy-to-use, fast, powerful server-side JavaScript. It's a joy to work with. I can't even explain how happy it makes me to be able to use that. It makes code reuse really possible. So we have this version of the desktop app that we're shipping with all the JavaScript from our web app, and we add new features to the web app, and we essentially get them for free in the desktop app as well. It's great. The tools are still pretty awful, but if you remember what it was like, if there's anyone here who remembers what it was like in the early 2000s or even the late 90s trying to build complicated JavaScript front ends, how awful, how terrible the tools were then. Looking at what we have now, we're really kind of spoiled. I guess it's like the whole, I had to do alerts in IE uphill both ways, and I was grateful for it or whatever. Mixing my metaphors. But the tools and testing are getting a lot better. And I'm confident that in all these new environments, it's going to get easier and easier as well. It's very exciting stuff. So if you want to follow me on Twitter, I talk about this stuff a lot. I can point you to the appropriate developers at Yammer who are specialists in these different areas. All of this information was compiled from a bunch of different people inside of Yammer, not just me. We have a brand new developer center, thanks to Michael Rogers, who has joined Yammer and has been working hard the past couple of months on this. It's very exciting to see that. Yeah, I guess that's it, unless there are questions. Questions? No? Okay. Thanks. Thanks a lot.
Did you remember the baby?
Oh, no.